The clock on the dashboard showed 7:30 p.m. when David finally left the auto repair shop. His back ached from being hunched over car engines all day, and his hands were still stained with motor oil despite washing them 3 times. All he wanted was to get home to his wife and 7-year-old daughter, maybe catch a few minutes of her bedtime story before she fell asleep. The evening traffic was surprisingly light on Highway 85. David drove his old pickup truck in the right lane, taking his time. After 12 hours of fixing other people's car problems, he wasn't in any rush to deal with road rage or aggressive drivers. The radio played soft jazz, and he found himself relaxing for the first time all day. That's when he saw it. About a mile ahead, a shiny black car sat on the shoulder of the highway. Its hazard lights blinked steadily and white steam poured from under the hood like a small volcano. Even from a distance, David could see it was an expensive car, a Mercedes, maybe a BMW, the kind of vehicle that cost more than he made in 2 years. As he got closer, David spotted an elderly man standing beside the car. The man wore a crisp business suit that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. His gray hair was perfectly styled, and even in distress, he carried himself with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of success. But right now, that confidence was nowhere to be seen. The man looked completely lost, staring at his smoking engine like it might magically fix itself. David's first instinct was to keep driving. He'd had a long day, he was tired, and honestly, a guy driving a car like that could probably afford to call a tow truck. Rich people had insurance for this kind of thing, right? They had credit cards and roadside assistance and all sorts of resources that David didn't have. But as his truck drew alongside the broken-down Mercedes, David caught sight of the man's face in his side mirror. The elderly gentleman looked genuinely worried, maybe even a little scared. He kept glancing at the heavy traffic rushing by, each car creating a gust of wind that made his expensive tie flutter. His phone was pressed to his ear, but from his frustrated expression it was clear he wasn't getting the help he needed. David's grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "Boy, you help folks when they need helping. Don't matter what they look like, or how much money they got. When someone's in trouble, you stop and help. That's what decent people do." With a heavy sigh, David put on his turn signal and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of the Mercedes. He sat in his truck for a moment, gathering energy he didn't really have. His wife was expecting him home. His daughter would be disappointed if he missed story time again, but the image of his grandfather's weathered face wouldn't leave his mind. David grabbed his work jacket from the passenger seat and climbed out of his truck. The elderly man noticed him immediately and watched with cautious eyes as David approached. Up close, the man looked to be in his 70s, with kind eyes behind expensive glasses. Despite his obvious wealth, there was something humble about the way he stood there, clearly out of his element. "Having some car trouble?" David asked, keeping his voice friendly and non-threatening. He'd learned over the years that his appearance sometimes made people nervous, especially when they were already stressed. The elderly man hesitated for a moment, clearly sizing David up. "Yes, I'm afraid so. The engine just started making this terrible noise, and then all this steam came pouring out. I've called my insurance company, but they say it'll be at least 2 hours before a tow truck can get here." David nodded and gestured toward the hood. "Mind if I take a look? I'm a mechanic. Just finished work, actually." The man's eyebrows rose, with interest, but he still seemed uncertain. "I don't want to impose. I'm sure you're eager to get home." "It's no trouble," David said, already walking toward the front of the car. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." The elderly man popped the hood, and David immediately saw the problem. A radiator hose had burst, sending coolant spraying everywhere. The engine was dangerously overheated, and if they didn't address it soon, the man would be looking at thousands of dollars in engine damage instead of a simple hose replacement. "Well, the good news is it's not as bad as it looks," David said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Bad news is you've got a burst radiator hose, and your engine's running way too hot. If we don't get this cooled down soon, you're going to have much bigger problems." The man's face fell. "How much bigger?" "Engine replacement bigger," David said honestly. "But we can prevent that if we act fast. The thing is, this car can't be driven anywhere like this. It needs to be towed to a shop and fixed properly. 2 hours for a tow truck," the man said quietly, more to himself than to David. "My wife is expecting me home. She worries when I'm late, especially since my heart attack last year." Something in the man's voice touched David deeply. Despite all his wealth and success, he was just a husband trying to get home to his worried wife. David made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. "Tell you what," David said. "I've got a tow strap in my truck. There's a gas station with a good service bay about 5 miles down the road. I could tow you there and take a look at fixing this tonight. Shouldn't take more than an hour or two." The elderly man stared at him in surprise. "You would do that? But surely you charge for emergency calls. I don't even know your rates." David shook his head. "Let's just worry about getting you back on the road. We can figure out the rest later." For the first time since David had stopped, the man smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile that transformed his entire face. "I'm Frank, by the way. Frank Peterson." "David," he replied, shaking Frank's offered hand. "David Johnson. Now let's get your car hooked up before this traffic gets any worse." As David walked back to his truck to get his tow strap, he couldn't help but smile. His grandfather would have been proud. Sure, he'd be late getting home, and sure, his back was going to ache even more by the time this was over. But there was something satisfying about helping someone in need, especially someone who seemed genuinely grateful for the assistance. He had no idea that the well-dressed elderly man he'd just met was about to change his life forever. All David knew was that a fellow human being needed help and he was in a position to provide it. Everything else would sort itself out later. The evening was still young, and David Johnson was about to discover that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest acts of kindness. The tow strap stretched tight between David's old pickup truck and Frank's expensive Mercedes as they slowly made their way toward Miller's gas station. David kept checking his rearview mirror, making sure the luxury car was following safely behind him. The last thing he wanted was to cause more damage to a vehicle that probably cost more than his house. Frank had insisted on riding with David in the pickup truck, claiming he didn't want to risk sitting in an overheated car. Truth was, David suspected the older man was just being polite. The Mercedes was probably more comfortable than his beat-up truck would ever be, even with a busted radiator. "I really can't thank you enough for this," Frank said, adjusting his seatbelt. "I've been driving for 50 years and I've never had anything like this happen." David glanced over at his passenger. Even in the dim light of the truck's interior, he could see that Frank was genuinely grateful. There was no trace of the entitlement or impatience that David sometimes encountered when working on expensive cars. "These things happen," David replied. "Cars don't care how much you paid for them when they decide to break down." Frank chuckled at that. "Very true. My wife always says I treat that car better than I treat myself. Maybe she's right." "How long have you been married?" David asked, mainly to keep the conversation going. The gas station was still a few miles away, and he wanted to keep Frank's mind off his car troubles. 43 years this November, Frank said, and David could hear the pride in his voice. "Met her at a church social when I was 25. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen and way too smart for a guy like me." "What made her give you a chance?" Frank was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I fixed her father's lawnmower," he said finally. "It was an old piece of junk that nobody else could get running. I spent 3 hours in their garage covered in grease and grass stains, determined to make that thing work. When it finally started up, she looked at me like I'd just performed magic." David smiled. "Sounds like you've always been good with your hands." "Used to be," Frank said, flexing his fingers. "Arthritis makes it harder now. Can't do the detailed work I used to love." They pulled into Miller's gas station just as the owner, Pete Miller, was getting ready to close up. Pete was a friend of David's, and he'd let David use his service bay before when someone needed emergency help. The two men had an understanding. David would clean up after himself and share whatever profit he made from the job. "Working late again, David?" Pete called out as they climbed out of the truck. "Emergency repair," David replied. "Mind if I use an bay 2 for a couple hours?" Pete looked at the Mercedes being towed behind David's truck and whistled low. That's some serious car trouble right there. Go ahead and use whatever you need. Frank tried to hand Pete a $20 bill for the use of the bay, but Pete waved him off with a grin. Any friend of David's doesn't pay here. That man's helped more stranded motorists than the highway patro. As they got the Mercedes positioned in the service bay, Frank kept trying to discuss payment with David. Every time he brought it up, David found a way to change the subject. The truth was, David hadn't even thought about money. His grandfather's voice kept echoing in his head about helping people in need, and something about Frank reminded him of his own grandfather. At least let me pay for the parts, Frank insisted as David gathered his tools. A radiator hose has got to cost something. We'll worry about that later, David said, pulling on his work gloves. Let's just focus on getting you back on the road. The radiator hose replacement was straightforward, but as David worked, he noticed several other issues. The brake pads were wearing thin, there was a loose belt that would probably fail within the next month, and the air filter hadn't been changed in way too long. None of these were emergencies, but they were all things that would cause problems soon. Frank stood nearby, watching David work with obvious fascination. You make this look so easy, he said. How long have you been doing this? Since I was about 12, David replied, not looking up from the engine. My grandfather ran a small garage, used to let me hang around after school, hand him tools, clean parts. By the time I was 16, I could rebuild an engine blindfolded. Is that where you learned about helping strangers? David paused in his work and looked up at Frank. The older man's question had caught him off guard. Yeah, actually. Grandpa always said that a man's character isn't measured by what he does when people are watching. It's measured by what he does when nobody's looking and there's nothing in it for him. Frank nodded slowly. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was, David said, returning to his work. Died when I was 22. Never got to meet my daughter. Tell me about your family, Frank said, settling onto a nearby stool. David found himself talking while he worked, telling Frank about his wife Lisa and their 7-year-old daughter Chloe. He talked about how Lisa worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling double shifts to help make ends meet. He mentioned that Chloe was the smartest kid in her class, but that they worried about affording college for her someday. What about you? David asked. Any kids? Frank's expression grew complicated. We have a son, Robert. He runs the family business now. We don't see eye to eye on much these days. David sensed there was more to that story, but he didn't push. Families were complicated, and he'd learned not to pry into other people's personal business. As David worked on the radiator, he also quietly fixed the loose belt and cleaned the air filter. He figured Frank probably wouldn't even notice, and it would save him trouble down the road. When he mentioned the brake pads, Frank immediately insisted on having those replaced too. I can't do brake work here, David explained. Don't have the right equipment, but you should get those looked at within the next couple weeks. Where do you recommend? David gave him the name of a good shop across town, even though it meant losing potential business for his own employer. The shop he recommended was more expensive, but they did excellent work and wouldn't try to oversell Frank on repairs he didn't need. 3 hours after they'd arrived at the gas station, the Mercedes was purring like new. David had test-driven it around the block twice to make sure everything was working properly. The temperature gauge stayed right where it should be, and all the systems were functioning perfectly. Frank stood beside his car, clearly amazed. It runs better now than it did before it broke down. Sometimes a little attention is all these cars need, David said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Frank reached for his wallet, but David held up a hand to stop him. I told you we'll worry about payment later. David, you've been working for, 3 hours. You've got to let me pay you something. The only payment I need is knowing you'll get home safely to your wife, David said. She's probably worried sick. Frank stared at him for a long moment, and David thought he saw the older man's eyes getting a little misty. There aren't many people like you left in this world, David Johnson. David just shrugged. There are more than you think. You just have to know where to look. Frank stood beside his perfectly running Mercedes, shaking his head in disbelief. The Car that had been completely dead 3 hours ago now hummed quietly, its engine temperature gauge sitting exactly where it should be. David had even cleaned the engine bay, making everything look spotless despite the roadside breakdown. "This is incredible," Frank said, running his hand along the hood. "I can't even hear the engine running." David smiled as he packed up his tools. German engineering. When these cars are maintained properly, they'll run forever. You just had some bad luck with that hose. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. "Now about payment. I insist on compensating you properly for this. What would a repair shop charge for this kind of emergency work?" "Frank, I already told you," David said, closing his toolbox. "I don't want your money. But you've spent your entire evening helping a complete stranger. You missed dinner with your family. Your wife is probably wondering where you are." David glanced at his phone. It was nearly 11 o'clock. Lisa would definitely be worried, and Chloe would be fast asleep by now. He'd missed bedtime story again, just like he'd feared. But looking at Frank's grateful face, he knew he'd made the right choice. "I'll call my wife on the way home," David said. "She'll understand." Frank opened his checkbook anyway. "At least let me pay for your time. 3 hours of skilled labor has to be worth something. What do you make at your regular job?" Frank seriously put the checkbook away. David's voice was firm, but kind. "You don't owe me anything." "Everyone needs money," Frank insisted. "You said yourself that you and your wife work hard to make ends meet. Let me help." David stopped packing his tools and looked directly at Frank. "You know what my grandfather used to say? He said that the moment you start expecting payment for doing the right thing, it stops being the right thing. It just becomes business." Frank stared at him for a long moment, then slowly closed his checkbook. "Your grandfather really did raise you right. He tried his best," David said. "Look, if it makes you feel better, just promise me you'll get those brake pads checked within the next 2 weeks. And maybe keep an eye on your coolant levels for the next few days, just to be safe." "I promise," Frank said. "But there has to be something I can do to repay this kindness." David thought about it as he loaded his tools into his truck. There was something he'd been curious about, but he wasn't sure how to ask without seeming nosy. "Well," David said slowly, "if you really want to do something, maybe you could tell me what kind of business you're in. That's a pretty impressive car for someone who doesn't know much about engines." Frank chuckled. "Fair question. I run a manufacturing company. We make parts for various industries. Started it about 30 years ago in a garage not much bigger than this service bay." "That's pretty amazing," David said. "What kind of parts?" "Oh, all sorts of things. Automotive components, industrial equipment, some aerospace work. We've been lucky enough to grow over the years." David nodded, impressed but not surprised. Frank had the bearing of someone who'd built something successful from the ground up. There was confidence in the way he carried himself, but also humility that came from remembering where he'd started. "Here," Frank said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a business card. "I'd like you to have this. If you ever need anything, or if you know someone looking for work, give me a call." David took the card and glanced at it briefly. The company name was Peterson Industries, and Frank's title was listed as founder and CEO. David had heard of Peterson Industries before. They were one of the bigger employers in the region, but he'd never really thought much about who ran the company. "Thanks," David said, slipping the card into his shirt pocket without really studying it. "I appreciate that." "No, thank you," Frank said. "And I want your contact information too. I'd like to recommend your services to people I know. There aren't many mechanics I'd trust with my car, but after tonight, you're definitely one of them." David pulled one of his business cards from his wallet. It was a simple card with his name, the auto shop's address, and his personal cell phone number. Nothing fancy, but it got the job done. Frank studied the card carefully, as if memorizing every detail. "Johnson's Auto Repair," he read aloud. "Is this your shop?" "No, I just work there," David explained. "It's owned by a guy named Bill Johnson. No relation, just coincidence. He's a good boss, though. Lets me take on side jobs like this as long as it doesn't interfere with my regular work." "And you're studying engineering in your spare time?" David was surprised Frank remembered that detail from their earlier conversation. Yeah, part-time at the community college. It's slow going with work and family, but I'm making progress. Hope to have my degree in another year or two. That's admirable, Frank said. What kind of engineering? Automotive, mostly. I love working with my hands, but I'd also like to understand the theory behind why things work the way they do. Maybe someday I'll design engines instead of just fixing them. Frank nodded thoughtfully. The world needs people who understand both the practical and theoretical sides of things. Too many engineers these days have never actually gotten their hands dirty. Pete Miller emerged from the gas station office, keys in hand. You boys about finished up? I need to lock up and get home before my wife sends out a search party. We're all done, David said. Thanks again for letting us use the bay, Pete. Anytime, Pete replied. Drive safe, both of you. Frank shook Pete's hand and tried once more to give him money for the use of the service bay, but Pete just laughed and walked away, waving off the offer. As they stood beside their vehicles in the now empty parking lot, Frank seemed reluctant to leave. David, I want you to know that what you did tonight goes way beyond just fixing a car. You restored my faith in people. I don't understand. Frank looked a little embarrassed. When you get to my age and position in life, you start to wonder if people are being nice to you because of who you are, or because of what you can do for them. Tonight you helped me when you thought I was just some random old man with car trouble. That means more to me than you'll ever know. David felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone would do. No, Frank said firmly. You did what anyone should do, but very few people actually would. There's a big difference. They shook hands one final time, and Frank's grip was strong and warm. Drive carefully getting home, David said, and remember about those brake pads. I won't forget, Frank promised. And David? Don't be surprised if you hear from me again soon. David climbed into his truck, wondering what Frank meant by that comment, but he was too tired to think about it much. All he wanted now was to get home, apologize to Lisa for being so late, and maybe peek in on Chloe before she woke up in the morning. As he drove away, David glanced in his rearview mirror and saw Frank still standing beside his Mercedes watching him go. Something about the older man's expression suggested this wouldn't be the last time their paths would cross. 2 weeks after the roadside encounter, David was elbow deep in the engine of a 1995 Honda Civic when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it since he was covered in grease and trying to figure out why the car was making a strange knocking sound. But something made him wipe his hands on his coveralls and check the caller ID. The number wasn't familiar, but the area code was local. David figured it might be a customer calling about their car, so he answered. Hello, this is David. Good morning, Mr. Johnson. This is Patricia Coleman from Peterson Industries. I'm calling about a potential employment opportunity that might interest you. David nearly dropped the phone. Peterson Industries was the company on Frank's business card, the one he'd barely glanced at before stuffing it in his pocket. He'd forgotten all about it until now. I'm sorry. I think there might be some mistake, David said. I didn't apply for any jobs at Peterson Industries. No mistake, Mr. Johnson. We have your contact information on file, and we'd like to invite you in for an interview. Are you available this Friday afternoon? David looked around the cluttered garage where he worked. Bill Johnson, his boss, was arguing with a supplier over the phone about late parts delivery. The place was busy but not exactly thriving. David made decent money, but he'd been in the same position for 3 years, with no real opportunity for advancement. Can I ask what kind of position this is for? David said. It's for a senior automotive engineer position in our new sustainable technology division. The salary range starts at $75,000 annually, with full benefits and tuition assistance for continuing education. David's jaw dropped. $75,000 was more than twice what he was making at the garage, and tuition assistance would mean he could finish his engineering degree without working himself to death. I'm interested, he managed to say. But I should mention that I haven't finished my engineering degree yet. I'm still 2 semesters away from graduating. That's not a problem, Mr. Johnson. We're looking for someone with practical experience combined with theoretical knowledge. Your background makes you an ideal candidate." David scheduled the interview for Friday at 2 o'clock, then spent the rest of the week in a daze. He told Lisa about the call that evening, and she was just as confused as he was. "How did they even get your name?" she asked as they sat at their small kitchen table after Chloe had gone to bed. "I have no idea," David said. "Maybe someone recommended me. I gave my card to that guy Frank a couple weeks ago. Maybe he knows someone at the company." "Frank was the old man with the broken-down Mercedes, right? The one you helped for free?" "Yeah, him. But I can't imagine how he'd have connections at Peterson Industries. He said he ran some small manufacturing company." Lisa smiled. "Well, whatever the reason, this could be exactly the break we've been hoping for. Just promise me you'll wear your good suit to the interview." Friday afternoon, David stood outside the imposing glass building that housed Peterson Industries headquarters. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with expensive-looking artwork on the walls. He'd never been in a building this fancy before, and he felt completely out of place despite wearing his best suit. The receptionist directed him to the elevators. "Top floor, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Coleman is expecting you." The elevator ride seemed to take forever. David's palms were sweating, and he kept checking his tie to make sure it was straight. He'd practiced answering interview questions all week, but now his mind was completely blank. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by a professional-looking woman in her 40s. "Mr. Johnson? I'm Patricia Coleman. Thank you so much for coming in today." She led him down a hallway lined with awards and photographs. David noticed several pictures of Peterson Industries' manufacturing facilities and community involvement projects. The company seemed much bigger than he'd imagined. "I have to admit I'm a little confused about how this interview came about," David said as they walked. "I didn't apply for any positions here." Patricia smiled. "You were recommended by someone, very highly regarded in our organization. He was quite insistent that we speak with you." They stopped in front of a large wooden door with a nameplate that read, "Frank Peterson, founder and CEO." David's heart nearly stopped. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I'm supposed to interview for an engineering position, not meet with the CEO." "No mistake at all," Patricia said, knocking on the door. "Mr. Peterson specifically requested to conduct this interview personally." A familiar voice called, "Come in," from inside the office. Patricia opened the door, and David found himself staring into the face of Frank, the elderly man whose car he'd fixed 2 weeks earlier. Frank was sitting behind an enormous desk in what was clearly the corner office of the entire building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the walls were covered with awards, photographs, and certificates. David stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth hanging open. Frank's face broke into a huge grin. "Hello again, David. Please come in and have a seat." "I don't understand," David said, slowly walking into the office. "You're Frank Peterson. As in Peterson Industries, Frank Peterson?" "Guilty as charged," Frank said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. "Though I have to say, you took my business card and didn't even look at it properly, did you?" David sank into the chair, still processing what was happening. "You said you ran a small manufacturing company." "Well, it was small when I started it 30 years ago," Frank chuckled. "It's grown a bit since then." Patricia excused herself, closing the door behind her and leaving the two men alone. Mr. Peterson," David stammered. "I had no idea who you were that night. If you had known, would you have done anything differently?" Frank interrupted. David thought about it honestly. "No, I don't think so. You needed help." "Exactly," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "And that's precisely why you're here." "I don't follow." Frank stood up and walked over to the windows, looking out at the city below. "David, I've been in business for 3 decades. I've worked with thousands of people in that time. Engineers, managers, salespeople, consultants. Most of them are technically competent, some are even brilliant, but very few of them have something that can't be taught in any school or learned from any textbook." "What's that?" Frank turned back to face him. "Character, integrity, the instinct to do the right thing even when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for you." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mr. Peterson, I appreciate the compliment, but I'm not sure I understand. What this has to do with a job interview? Everything, Frank said, returning to his desk. You see, after you fixed my car that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd done, so I did some research. Frank opened a file folder on his desk. I called your boss at the garage, Bill. Johnson had nothing but praise for your work ethic and honesty. I spoke with your professors at the community college. They said you're one of the brightest students they've ever had, despite carrying a full course load while working full-time. I even visited the gas station where you fixed my car. Pete Miller told me you've helped at least a dozen stranded motorists over the past year, always refusing payment. David felt his face getting red. Mr. Peterson, I just do what needs doing. And that, Frank said, pointing at him, is exactly why you're perfect for what I have in mind. Frank opened another folder on his desk and pulled out what looked like a job description. David, Peterson Industries is launching a new division focused on sustainable automotive technology, electric vehicle components, hybrid systems, clean energy solutions for the transportation industry. It's the future of our business and, frankly, the future of the entire automotive industry. David nodded, though he still felt like he was in some kind of dream. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been a garage mechanic helping a stranded motorist. Now he was sitting in a corner office discussing the future of the automotive industry with a CEO. The thing is, Frank continued, we've interviewed dozens of candidates for this position. People with impressive degrees from prestigious universities, engineers with years of experience at major corporations. On paper, they all look perfect. But, David prompted, but when I ask them why they want to work here, they talk about career, advancement and salary packages and stock options. When I ask them about their vision for sustainable transportation, they give me rehearsed answers they found online. None of them have any real passion for the work itself. Frank stood up and walked over to a wall covered with photographs. Many of them showed factory workers, engineers, and various Peterson Industries facilities. But what caught David's attention was a picture of a much younger Frank standing next to an old beat-up car in what looked like a small garage. That's where I started, Frank said, noticing David's gaze. 1994. In a rented garage not much bigger than the service bay where you fixed my car. I had an idea for a better way to manufacture brake components, but no money and no connections. Just a lot of determination and a willingness to work 18-hour days. What made you keep going? I believed in what I was doing, Frank said simply. I wasn't trying to get rich or impress anyone. I just thought I could make car brakes safer and more reliable. Everything else came later. Frank returned to his desk and picked up David's business card, which was sitting next to his computer. When you fixed my car that night, you reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. You didn't help me because you thought I was important or because you wanted something from me. You helped me because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of person I want leading this new division. David's head was spinning. Mr. Peterson, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for a leadership position. I haven't even finished my engineering degree yet. David, can I tell you something about qualifications? Frank leaned forward in his chair. The most qualified person on paper isn't always the best person for the job. I'd rather have someone with integrity and practical experience than someone with a perfect resume and no character. Frank opened the job description folder and slid it across the desk. This position comes with a starting salary of $85,000 annually, full health benefits for your entire family, and complete tuition coverage for you to finish your degree. We'll also pay for any additional training or certifications you want to pursue. David picked up the papers with shaking hands. The salary alone was almost 3 times what he was making at the garage. With benefits and tuition coverage, this job would completely transform his family's life. There's more, Frank said. We're offering a signing bonus of $10,000, and after your first year, you'll be eligible for profit sharing. If this division succeeds the way I think it will, that profit sharing could be substantial. This is incredible, David said, scanning the job description. But Mr. Peterson, I have to be honest with you. I don't have any experience managing people or running a division. That's exactly why you're perfect for this job, Frank said with a smile. You don't have any bad habits to unlearn. And frankly, the people skills you'll need most are the same ones you showed me that night on the highway. The ability to listen, to solve problems, and to treat people with respect regardless of who they are. David set the papers down on the desk. Can I ask you something? Why is this so important to you? You could hire any engineer in the country for this position. Frank was quiet for a moment, and David could see he was choosing his words carefully. I mentioned that my wife and I have a son, Robert. He's been groomed to take over this company since he was in high school. MBA from Harvard, worked at consulting firms, knows all the latest business theories. That sounds impressive. It is. Impressive on paper. But Robert sees this business as nothing more than profit margins and market share. He doesn't understand that we're not just making parts, we're making products that keep families safe on the road. He's never gotten his hands dirty, never helped a stranger, never done anything just because it was the right thing to do. Frank picked up a framed photo from his desk, showing him with a younger man in an expensive suit. I've been trying to find a way to show Robert what real leadership looks like. Someone who leads by example instead of by authority. Someone who understands that business is about people, not just numbers. David began to understand. You want me to work with your son? I want you to show him what it means to build something meaningful, Frank said. This sustainable technology division will be your project to lead, but Robert will be working closely with you. If you can teach him even half of what your grandfather taught you, it will be worth every penny of your salary. The weight of the opportunity was overwhelming. David thought about Lisa working double shifts at the hospital, about Chloe's college fund that barely had enough money to last a year, about his own dreams of finishing his engineering degree. This job would solve all of those problems and more. But he also thought about Bill Johnson, his current boss, who had always treated him fairly. Mr. Peterson, I'd need to give my current employer at least 2 weeks' notice. Bill's been good to me, and I wouldn't want to leave him in a difficult position. Frank smiled broadly. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. Take as much time as you need to wrap things up. We can start you on the 1st of next month if that works better. David stood up and extended his hand. Mr. Peterson, I accept your offer, and I promise you won't regret this decision. Frank shook his hand firmly. I know I won't. And David, call me Frank. We're going to be working together for a long time. 6 months later, David stood in front of the newest Peterson Industries facility, watching as workers installed the sign for the Sustainable Transportation Division. His team of 12 engineers had just completed their first major project, a revolutionary electric vehicle battery system that would extend driving range by 40%. More importantly, Robert Peterson had become not just a colleague, but a friend. Working alongside David had taught him to value practical experience and genuine relationships over spreadsheets and profit projections. The two men had developed a mutual respect that was transforming the entire company culture. David watched the sun set over the facility. He pulled out his phone and called Frank. The sign's up, he said when Frank answered. The Sustainable Transportation Division is officially open for business. How does it feel? Frank asked. David smiled, thinking about that night 2 weeks ago when he'd stopped to help a stranded motorist. It feels like the beginning of something amazing. And it was. David's simple act of kindness had not only changed his own life, but had started a ripple effect that would transform an entire company and inspire countless others to choose compassion over convenience.